Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of the Kentucky mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. On a freezing January morning in 1919, Professor Edmund Whitaker of the University of Kentucky received a letter that would consume the remaining years of his life. The letter, written in precise handwriting on cheap paper, contained a mathematical proof that should not have existed. More disturbing than the proof itself was its author, Margaret Thorne, a 19-year-old woman from Pine Hollow, Kentucky, who had never attended school beyond the age of 12. This is her story, and what it revealed about the human mind remains unexplained to this day. The year 1919 marked the end of the Great War and the beginning of a new era in America. Soldiers were returning home to find a country transformed by industrialization and social change. Cities were growing, electricity was spreading, and the promise of modern life seemed within reach for many Americans. But in the remote valleys of eastern Kentucky, life remained much as it had been for generations. Communities clung to mountainsides, connected by rough trails and isolated by geography that made the outside world feel very far away indeed. Pine Hollow was one such community, tucked into a narrow valley in Pike County, approximately 70 miles southeast of Lexington. In 1919, the settlement consisted of perhaps 40 families, most engaged in subsistence farming and coal mining. There was no electricity, no telephone service, no paved roads. The nearest town with a post office was Elkhorn City, a full day's journey on horseback over mountain trails that became impassable in winter. Margaret Thorne was born in Pine Hollow in March 1900, the daughter of Samuel and Eleanor Thorne. Samuel worked as a timber cutter, felling trees on the mountainsides and floating them down the creek to the Cumberland River during spring floods. Eleanor kept house and raised their 5 children in a 2-room cabin built by Samuel's grandfather in the 1850s. They were poor by any standard, but no poorer than their neighbors, and the community took care of its own. According to records preserved in the Pike County Historical Society, Margaret attended the 1-room schoolhouse in Pine Hollow from age 6 until age 12. The school, taught by a rotating series of teachers who rarely stayed more than a year, provided basic instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Margaret was remembered by her teachers as a quiet, unremarkable student, neither particularly gifted nor notably struggling. She learned to read adequately, could write simple sentences, and mastered basic arithmetic operations. In 1912, at age 12, she left school to help her mother at home, a common trajectory for girls in that community. For the next 6 years, Margaret's life followed the expected pattern for young women in Pine Hollow. She helped with household chores, tended the family garden, cared for her younger siblings, and learned the skills necessary to run a mountain household. In 1917, she was courted by Thomas Reed, the son of a neighboring family, and they were expected to marry when Thomas returned from military service. He had enlisted in the Army in April 1917. Shortly after America entered the war, and was serving somewhere in France. It was in November 1918, just days after the armistice that ended the Great War, that Margaret began to change. According to testimony later given by her mother to researchers, Margaret woke one morning complaining of a severe headache. The pain was so intense that she could not open her eyes, could not bear light or sound, could barely speak. Eleanor treated her daughter with the remedies she knew. Willbark tea for pain, cool compresses for fever, chamomile for sleep. Nothing helped. The headache persisted for 5 days. Margaret remained in bed in the darkened cabin, occasionally crying out in pain, mostly lying still as if any movement increased her suffering. On the 5th day, suddenly as it had begun, The headache disappeared. Margaret opened her eyes, sat up, and asked for food. She seemed entirely recovered, perhaps a bit weak from days without eating, but otherwise herself. Except she wasn't herself. Not entirely. Something fundamental had changed during those 5 days of agony, though no one in the family could identify exactly what. Margaret seemed distant, distracted, as if listening to sounds no one else could hear. She would stop in the middle of tasks and stare into space for long minutes before shaking herself and resuming work. Most strangely, she began to spend hours alone in the small shed behind the cabin where Samuel kept his tools, writing on scraps of paper and boards with a piece of charcoal. Eleanor, concerned about her daughter's odd behavior, asked what she was doing. Margaret struggled to explain. She saw patterns, she said, mathematical patterns in everything around her, in the way water flowed in the creek, in the arrangement of leaves on tree branches, in the spacing of fence posts, in the flight of birds across the sky. These patterns demanded to be written down, needed to be expressed in numbers and symbols, even though Margaret had no formal mathematical education beyond basic arithmetic. The family initially dismissed this as a peculiar phase, perhaps brought on by worry over Thomas Reed, who had not yet returned from France. But as weeks passed, Margaret's obsession with these patterns intensified rather than fading. She covered every available surface in the tool shed with mathematical notations, filling boards, scraps of paper, even the dirt floor with complex equations that meant nothing to her family. Samuel Thorne, growing frustrated with his daughter's strange behavior, ordered her to stop wasting time on nonsense and focus on practical work. Margaret tried to comply, but she found herself unable to ignore the patterns she saw. They pressed on her consciousness like physical weight, demanding expression, requiring documentation. She began to suffer headaches again when she tried to suppress the urge to write. And eventually her father relented, allowing her to spend a few hours each day in the shed with her papers and charcoal. It was in January 1919 that an unexpected visitor arrived in Pine Hollow who would change everything. Reverend Jonathan Marsh, a circuit preacher who traveled through the mountains bringing religious services to isolated communities, stopped at the Thorne cabin seeking shelter from a snowstorm. The family, following mountain hospitality traditions, took him in for the night despite their limited resources. After supper, as the family sat around the fireplace, Reverend Marsh noticed Margaret's hands. They were blackened with charcoal, and she kept making small movements with her fingers, as if writing on an invisible surface. When he asked about it, Eleanor explained her daughter's strange compulsion to fill papers with numbers and symbols. Marsh, who had studied at a seminary in Ohio before coming to Kentucky, asked if he might see what Margaret had written. The next morning, when the storm cleared, Marsh examined the contents of the tool shed. What he found astonished him. The walls were covered with mathematical notations, some familiar, many completely foreign to him. He recognized basic algebraic operations mixed with what appeared to be much more advanced mathematics. There were series expansions, differential notations, and symbolic representations that suggested knowledge far beyond what any 12-year-old education in a one-room mountain schoolhouse could have provided. More intriguing were the papers Margaret had covered with what Marsh realized were attempts to solve specific problems. One paper contained what appeared to be an effort to calculate the volume of irregular three-dimensional shapes. Another showed a method for approximating the value of pi to dozens of decimal places. A third contained what looked like an attempt to describe the motion of projectiles through air, with equations accounting for wind resistance and gravity. Marsh was no mathematician himself, but he had enough education to recognize that what he was seeing was extraordinary and impossible. Margaret Thorne, with virtually no formal education, was working on problems that would challenge university students. Moreover, she was using mathematical notations and approaches that she could not possibly have encountered in her isolated mountain community. When Marsh asked Margaret where she had learned these things, the girl struggled to explain. She hadn't learned them, she insisted. She saw them. After the headache in November, she had begun to perceive mathematical structures underlying physical reality. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a hidden architecture of numbers and relationships that had always been there but which she had never noticed before. She could look at a tree and see the equation that described its growth pattern. She could watch water in the creek and perceive the formula governing its flow. The mathematics simply appeared to her, fully formed, demanding to be recorded. Reverend Marsh made a decision that would have profound consequences. He convinced Samuel Thorne to allow him to take some of Margaret's papers to Lexington, to show them to professors at the University of Kentucky who might understand their significance. Samuel, skeptical but willing to humor the preacher who had been kind to his family, agreed. Marsh carefully selected several of the clearest examples of Margaret's work and departed Pine Hollow with promises to return within a month. It was Marsh who delivered the papers to Professor Edmund Whittaker in early February 1919. Whittaker was chairman of the mathematics department at the University of Kentucky, a respected scholar who had published papers on differential equations and had studied under prominent mathematicians in Europe before the war. When Marsh appeared at his office with a story about an untutored mountain girl solving advanced mathematical problems, Whittaker's first instinct was to dismiss it as either fraud or delusion. But Whittaker was thorough. He examined the papers Marsh had brought, initially assuming they were copied from textbooks or stolen from some other source. What he found made that explanation impossible. Yes, some of the mathematics was recognizable, similar to techniques taught in university courses. But other approaches were novel, showing methods for solving problems that Whittaker had never encountered. Even more intriguing, some of the notations Margaret used were idiosyncratic, mathematical symbols of her own invention that made sense within the context of her work, but which no one had taught her. The paper that most captured Whittaker's attention was one covered with what appeared to be an attempt to solve what mathematicians called the three-body problem, the question of how three objects interacting gravitationally will move over time. This problem had occupied some of the greatest mathematical minds for centuries. It was known to have no general solution using traditional analytical methods. Yet, here was this mountain girl apparently developing a new approach, using iterative approximations and geometric insights that suggested genuine mathematical intuition. Whittaker spent 3 days studying the papers before concluding that they were authentic, that they genuinely represented the work of someone with extraordinary but untrained mathematical ability. He wrote a letter to Reverend Marsh requesting permission to travel to Pine Hollow to meet Margaret Thorne personally. Marsh replied affirmatively, and in March 1919, Professor Edmund Whittaker made the difficult journey into the Kentucky mountains to find the source of these impossible equations. The journey from Lexington to Pine Hollow took Whittaker 4 days. He traveled by train to Elkhorn City, then hired a guide with horses to navigate the mountain trails. According to his journal, preserved in the University of Kentucky archives, Whittaker found the journey both physically exhausting and intellectually exhilarating. He was traveling to meet someone who might represent a genuine prodigy, a mathematical genius emerging from the most unlikely circumstances. When Whittaker arrived at the Thorne cabin on a cold afternoon in mid-March, he found a family living in conditions of profound poverty. The cabin was roughly constructed, drafty, heated only by a single fireplace. The Thornes owned almost nothing. Furniture was handmade and crude. Clothing was patched and worn. Food was simple and scarce. Yet Eleanor Thorne welcomed him with mountain hospitality, offering what little they had and treating the university professor with shy respect. Margaret herself initially seemed unremarkable. She was 19 years old, small and thin, with the worn hands of someone who had worked hard her entire life. She was quiet, speaking only when directly addressed, and seemed uncomfortable with Whittaker's presence and intense attention. It was only when he began asking about her mathematics that she became animated, her eyes brightening as she struggled to find words to describe what she saw. Whitaker spent 3 days at the Thorne cabin, sleeping on the floor near the fireplace, eating simple meals of cornbread and beans, and conducting what he later described as the most extraordinary examination of his career. He brought with him pencils, paper, and several mathematics textbooks. He designed tests specifically to determine whether Margaret had somehow acquired formal mathematical training without anyone knowing, or whether her abilities represented something genuinely spontaneous and unexplainable. The first test was simple. Whitaker presented Margaret with a basic calculus problem, the sort of exercise given to first-year university students. Find the derivative of this function. Margaret stared at the problem for several minutes, then asked what a derivative was. Whitaker explained the concept, the rate of change of a function, the slope of a tangent line. As he spoke, he watched Margaret's face transform. Understanding seemed to flood through her, not gradually but all at once, as if the concept he was explaining connected to something she already knew but had never named. Without hesitation, Margaret solved the problem. Then she solved 3 more problems Whitaker presented, each progressively more difficult. Then she began generating her own problems, extensions and variations that demonstrated deep intuitive understanding of calculus concepts she had learned mere minutes earlier. Whitaker was astounded. This was not rote memorization or mechanical application of rules. This was genuine mathematical thinking emerging in real time. The second test was more complex. Whitaker showed Margaret a proof from his textbook, a demonstration that certain infinite series converged to specific values. He asked her to explain what the proof meant. Margaret studied it carefully, then began to dissect it step by step, identifying the logical structure, recognizing techniques, and eventually suggesting an alternative approach that might simplify the argument. She did all this in language that mixed formal mathematical terms Whitaker had just taught her with her own invented vocabulary. It was clear she understood not just the mechanics of the proof, but its deeper logical architecture. For the third test, Whitaker presented Margaret with an unsolved problem, a question he himself had been working on related to solutions of differential equations. He did not expect her to solve it. He simply wanted to see how she would approach a problem at the frontier of current mathematical research. Margaret studied the problem for nearly an hour, occasionally asking Whitaker to clarify notation or explain terms. Then she began to work, covering page after page with calculations, explorations, attempts at different approaches. She did not solve the problem, but what she produced amazed Whitaker. Her work showed sophistication far beyond what anyone with her minimal education should possess. More importantly, one of her approaches, a method using geometric reasoning to transform the differential equation into a more tractable form, was genuinely novel. Whitaker recognized immediately that this technique, properly developed, might lead to new solutions. He had witnessed the birth of a new mathematical idea in real time, emerging from the mind of an untutored 19-year-old girl in a mountain cabin. On the final day of his visit, Whitaker asked Margaret the question that had been troubling him since he first saw her papers. How did she do it? Where did this mathematical ability come from? Margaret struggled to answer. She described the headache in November, the 5 days of agony, and the change that came afterward. Before the headache, she said, the world had been ordinary, solid, comprehensible in simple terms. After the headache, everything revealed itself as patterns, as mathematical structures, as equations describing relationships and changes. It's like I was blind, Margaret explained, and then I could see, but what I see now isn't the world the way other people see it. I see the numbers underneath, the patterns that make everything work. And once I see them, I have to write them down. It's like they demand to be recorded, like they need to exist on paper as well as in my mind. Whitaker asked whether the headache had been caused by some injury or illness. Margaret didn't think so. There had been no fall, no fever, no obvious physical trauma. The pain had simply arrived one morning and departed 5 days later, leaving her changed in this fundamental way. Whitaker examined her as best he could given his limited medical knowledge. He found no obvious neurological damage, no signs of tumor or injury that might explain the transformation. Before leaving Pine Hollow, Whitaker made Margaret an offer. He would arrange for her to come to Lexington, to study at the university, to receive proper mathematical training that could develop her extraordinary natural abilities. The University of Kentucky, he assured the Thorne family, would provide room, board, and education at no cost. Margaret would have access to libraries, to other mathematicians, to all the resources necessary to nurture her gift. Samuel and Eleanor were reluctant. They needed Margaret's labor at home, could not easily spare her. Moreover, they were suspicious of the outside world, uncomfortable with the idea of their daughter living among strangers in a city. But Reverend Marsh, who had remained at the cabin during Whitaker's visit, added his persuasion. This was an opportunity that could not be refused, a chance for Margaret to escape the poverty and isolation that trapped most people born in these mountains. Eventually, the family agreed. In April 1919, Margaret Thorne left Pine Hollow for the first time in her life, traveling with Professor Whitaker to Lexington. She brought almost nothing with her: one change of clothes, a few personal items, and dozens of papers covered with her mathematical notations. She was 19 years old, had never been more than 10 miles from home, and was entering a world completely foreign to everything she had known. The transition was difficult. Margaret was overwhelmed by Lexington, by its size, its noise, its crowds of strangers. She was housed in a boarding house near the university, sharing a room with another young woman, a situation that felt bizarre to someone accustomed to the isolation of mountain life. The food was different. The social customs were different. Even the language people spoke sounded foreign, with different accents and vocabulary than what she knew from Pike County. But the mathematics was universal. When Whitaker brought Margaret to his office and showed her the university library, with its hundreds of mathematical texts, the girl wept. Here was knowledge. Here were the patterns she had been seeking, recorded by others who had seen what she saw. She devoured books, reading for 10, 12, 14 hours a day, absorbing centuries of mathematical development in a matter of weeks. Other professors began to hear about the mountain prodigy. Some were skeptical, assuming Whitaker had been deceived by a clever fraud. Others were intrigued. Dr. Robert Chen, who taught physics, asked to meet Margaret to test her abilities in his own domain. Chen presented Margaret with problems in classical mechanics, in thermodynamics, in electromagnetic theory. Margaret, who had never formally studied physics, nevertheless grasped the mathematical structures underlying these phenomena with startling speed. It was Chen who first documented what he called Margaret's instantaneous comprehension of mathematical concepts. Unlike normal students who learned through gradual accumulation of knowledge, Margaret seemed to absorb entire frameworks of understanding all at once. Show her one example, explain one concept, and she immediately grasped its implications, its connections to other ideas, its potential applications. It was as if her mind had been prepared in advance to receive mathematical knowledge, as if the headache had restructured her brain to optimize it for this one specific domain of thought. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, one of the few female professors at the university, teaching in the English department, took a personal interest in Margaret. She recognized that the girl was struggling socially even as she thrived intellectually. Morrison helped Margaret navigate the social world of the university, taught her how to dress appropriately, how to speak to professors and other students, how to manage the practical details of urban life that mountain upbringing had not prepared her. It was Morrison who documented Margaret's description of how her mathematical vision actually functioned. According to notes preserved in Morrison's personal papers, Margaret explained that she perceived mathematical structures as visual patterns overlaid on physical reality. When she looked at a tree, she saw not just bark and branches, but also the equations describing its growth, its response to wind and gravity, its biochemical processes. When she watched water flowing, she saw the partial differential equations governing fluid dynamics. The mathematics was not abstract to her. It was concrete, visible, inescapable. This mode of perception came at a cost. Margaret suffered from severe headaches whenever she tried to suppress her mathematical vision. Whenever she attempted to see the world the way others saw it, the headaches would build over hours until they became unbearable, forcing her to give in, to let the patterns flood back into her awareness. She learned not to fight it, to accept that this was how her mind now worked. For better or worse, by June 1919, Margaret's reputation had spread beyond the University of Kentucky. Professor Whitaker wrote to colleagues at other institutions describing her abilities. Some responded with interest, others with skepticism. Dr. Hermann Schneider from Harvard University traveled to Lexington specifically to examine Margaret and verify Whitaker's claims. Schneider's examination was rigorous and skeptical. He assumed fraud and designed his tests to expose it. He presented Margaret with problems from his own research, problems at the absolute frontier of current mathematics, problems that had stumped professional mathematicians for years. He gave her no hints, no guidance, simply stated the problems, and watched to see what she would do. Margaret could not solve all of Schneider's problems. Some were too advanced, requiring knowledge she simply did not yet possess despite her rapid learning. But her approaches, the ways she thought about the problems, revealed genuine mathematical creativity. More remarkably, for one problem related to convergence of infinite series, Margaret developed a solution technique that Schneider recognized as both correct and original. She had, in the space of 3 hours, produced a result worthy of publication in a professional mathematics journal. Schneider's report, submitted to the American Mathematical Society in July 1919, described Margaret as the most extraordinary mathematical mind I have encountered in 30 years of academic work. He called for serious scientific study of her abilities and cognitive processes. How had an untutored girl from rural Kentucky developed capabilities that matched or exceeded those of trained mathematicians? What had the headache done to her brain? Could her abilities be understood, replicated, or explained? The response from the mathematical community was mixed. Some professors wanted to study Margaret scientifically, to understand the neurological basis of her abilities. Others saw her as a threat, an outsider who had not earned her knowledge through proper academic channels and thus deserved no recognition. Still others dismissed the entire case as impossible, arguing that Whitaker and Schneider had been deceived by a clever hoax, or had exaggerated Margaret's abilities for their own aggrandizement. It was in this context of controversy and fascination that Margaret began to change again. In August 1919, she reported to Professor Whitaker that her mathematical visions were intensifying, where before she had seen patterns overlaid on reality. Now the patterns were becoming more insistent, more demanding, more difficult to ignore. She was having trouble sleeping, because closing her eyes did not stop the mathematics. Equations scrolled through her mind continuously. Problems presented themselves unbidden. Solutions emerged whether she sought them or not. Dr. Vincent Harlow, a neurologist from Louisville, examined Margaret in September 1919. His examination was the most thorough medical assessment she had received. Harlow tested her reflexes, her sensory responses, her memory, her cognitive functions. He found no obvious pathology, no tumor, no infection, no structural abnormality in her brain. Yet clearly something fundamental had changed in her neurology after the headache in November 1918. Harlow documented several unusual findings. Margaret's visual processing appeared altered. When shown geometric figures, her eye movement suggested she was perceiving mathematical relationships rather than simply seeing shapes. Her response time to mathematical problems was extraordinarily fast, far beyond normal limits, as if the computational processes in her brain had been accelerated. Most puzzling, her EEG patterns showed unusual activity in regions associated with both visual processing and abstract reasoning. Patterns Harlow had never seen before and could not explain. It is as if, Harlow wrote in his report, portions of her brain normally dedicated to visual perception have been repurposed for mathematical cognition. She quite literally sees mathematics in a way the rest of us do not. Whether this represents a form of synesthesia, a reorganization following neurological trauma, or something entirely unprecedented, I cannot say. What is clear is that Margaret Thorne's brain functions differently from normal human brains in ways we do not yet understand. In October 1919, Margaret made a discovery that would seal her fate. She had been working on problems related to prime numbers, those integers divisible only by themselves, and one. Prime numbers had fascinated mathematicians for millennia, because they seemed to appear randomly in the sequence of natural numbers, yet clearly followed some hidden pattern. Margaret believed she could see that pattern. Over the course of 3 weeks, working alone in the university library late into the night, Margaret developed what she believed was a formula for generating prime numbers. Not an approximation, not a probabilistic method, but an exact formula that could calculate the nth prime number without having to check all previous numbers for primality. If true, this would represent one of the most significant mathematical discoveries in history, a solution to a problem that had resisted centuries of effort. Margaret showed her work to Professor Whittaker in early November. Whittaker was initially skeptical. Such a formula was believed to be impossible. But as he examined Margaret's proof, his skepticism turned to astonishment. Her approach was unlike anything he had seen, using geometric insights and algebraic manipulations that revealed deep structure in the distribution of primes. He could not immediately find any error in her reasoning. Whittaker brought in other mathematicians to examine Margaret's work. For 2 weeks, the faculty of the mathematics department worked to verify or refute her proof. They found her logic sound, her methods valid, her conclusions apparently correct. If Margaret was right, and the formula worked as she claimed, then she had accomplished something extraordinary, solved a problem that had been open for thousands of years. But there was a problem. Margaret's formula was elegant and appeared correct, but actually computing prime numbers using her method required calculations of extraordinary complexity. The formula worked in theory, but in practice, calculating even moderately large primes using her approach would take more time than all the mathematicians in the world working together for centuries could provide. The formula existed. It was correct, but it was computationally useless. This paradox, a solution that was simultaneously right and impractical, devastated Margaret. She had seen the pattern, had captured it in mathematical notation, had proven its validity, but the very formula she had worked so hard to derive could not actually be used for its intended purpose. It was like discovering a map to buried treasure, but finding that the map was written in ink that could only be read once before fading forever. In December 1919, Margaret's condition deteriorated sharply. The constant pressure of mathematical patterns in her consciousness became overwhelming. She could not eat without seeing the geometry of her food. She could not walk without perceiving the equations of motion. She could not sleep without equations scrolling through her dreams. Professor Whittaker, alarmed, had her admitted to the university hospital for observation and treatment. Dr. Helen Cartwright, who oversaw Margaret's care, documented the progression of her condition. Margaret was experiencing what Cartwright called cognitive overload. her brain producing mathematical insights faster than she could record them, faster than she could even consciously process them. It was as if the headache in November 1918 had removed some natural limit on mathematical cognition. And now, a year later, that cognition was consuming her from within. Cartwright tried various treatments, sedatives to help Margaret sleep, therapies to help her control her thoughts, techniques to filter or suppress the mathematical visions. Nothing worked. The mathematics was too fundamental to how Margaret's brain now functioned. Suppressing it did not bring relief, but instead caused more intense headaches, as if her mind was fighting itself, one part trying to see patterns while another part tried to look away. In January 1920, Margaret requested to return to Pine Hollow. She told Dr. Cartwright that she needed to go home, to be with her family, to die where she had been born. The doctors tried to convince her to stay, to continue treatment, but Margaret was insistent. She knew what was coming, she said. She could see it the way she saw everything else, as a mathematical pattern reaching its inevitable conclusion. Professor Whitaker arranged for Margaret to be transported back to Pike County in February 1920. He traveled with her, along with Dr. Cartwright, making the difficult winter journey into the mountains. They delivered Margaret to her family and promised to return in the spring to check on her progress. Both Whitaker and Cartwright privately believed they would never see Margaret alive again. And they were right. Margaret Thorne died on March 17, 1920, in the same cabin where she had been born, in the same bed where she had suffered the headache that changed her forever. She was 20 years old. Dr. Cartwright, who returned to Pine Hollow as soon as weather permitted in early April, examined Margaret's body and could find no obvious cause of death. The girl had simply stopped, her heart ceasing to beat, her brain ceasing to function, as if the extraordinary processes that had consumed her consciousness for 16 months had finally exhausted whatever resource sustained them. Eleanor Thorne reported that in her final weeks, Margaret had spoken little, had eaten almost nothing, had spent long hours sitting by the window staring at the mountains. When asked what she was thinking about, Margaret would say only patterns or numbers or sometimes nothing at all. On the day she died, she had seemed calm, almost relieved. She told her mother that she could finally rest, that the equations were finally quiet, that she could see the world the way other people saw it again, simple and solid, and blessedly free of mathematics. Professor Whitaker returned to Lexington devastated by Margaret's death. He kept all her papers, hundreds of pages covered with mathematical notations, and spent years trying to understand and develop the ideas she had begun. Some of her work was publishable, genuine contributions to mathematical knowledge. Other work was too incomplete or too idiosyncratic to share. The prime number formula remained locked away, a beautiful but useless solution to an ancient problem. In 1923, Whitaker wrote a memoir about his time with Margaret, titled The Mountain Prodigy, a study in spontaneous mathematical genius. The manuscript was never published during his lifetime. University administrators feared it would damage the institution's reputation to be associated with such an extraordinary and inexplicable case. The memoir was finally published in 1968, edited by Whitaker's grandson, but by then the case of Margaret Thorne had been largely forgotten. What do we make of Margaret Thorne's story today? The documentation is extensive. Whitaker's papers are preserved at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Schneider's report exists in the archives of the American Mathematical Society. Dr. Harlow's neurological examination is filed with the Louisville Medical College. Margaret's own papers, the hundreds of pages she filled with equations, are held in restricted access at the university library. The evidence of her abilities is undeniable. Yet, how do we explain it? How does an untutored girl from rural Kentucky suddenly develop mathematical abilities that matched professional mathematicians? What did the headache in November 1918 do to her brain? Why did her abilities intensify to the point of becoming unbearable? And why did she die at age 20 with no apparent physical cause? Modern neuroscience offers some potential explanations. We know that traumatic brain events can sometimes trigger remarkable cognitive changes. There are documented cases of people developing extraordinary abilities after head injuries or strokes, conditions known as acquired savant syndrome. Perhaps Margaret experienced some form of neurological event during the headache, a hemorrhage or seizure or infection that reorganized neural pathways in ways that enhanced mathematical processing while sparing other functions. But this explanation has problems. Acquired savant syndrome typically follows obvious brain trauma, injuries severe enough to cause lasting neurological deficits. Margaret had no such deficits. She was neurologically normal except for her mathematical abilities. Moreover, her abilities continued to develop and intensify rather than stabilizing at some fixed level. This pattern does not match typical acquired savant cases. Another possibility is that Margaret had latent mathematical genius that was somehow unlocked by the headache. Perhaps her brain had always possessed extraordinary computational capabilities, but lacked the neural connections necessary to access them consciously. The headache, according to this theory, established those connections, allowing her conscious mind to tap into cognitive resources normally unavailable. But this still does not explain why those resources eventually overwhelmed her, why the gift became a curse that consumed her completely. Some researchers have suggested that Margaret's case represents a form of severe synesthesia, a condition where stimulation of one sensory pathway triggers experiences in another. People with synesthesia might see sounds or taste words. Perhaps Margaret developed an extreme form where all visual perception was automatically translated into mathematical representation. But synesthesia typically does not cause the kind of cognitive overload Margaret experienced, and it certainly does not typically lead to death. The most disturbing possibility, and the one Professor Whitaker came to believe in his later years, is that Margaret's headache did not unlock existing abilities but rather opened her mind to something external, something that entered her consciousness and used her brain as a channel for expressing mathematical truths that existed independent of human thought. In his private journals, never published, Whitaker wrote about his growing conviction that mathematics was not invented by humans but discovered, that mathematical truths existed eternally in some Platonic realm, and that gifted mathematicians were merely scribes recording what they glimpsed of that realm. Margaret, Whitaker wrote in 1935, did not develop mathematical abilities. She became a conduit for mathematics itself. The headache broke down some barrier between her consciousness and the realm of pure mathematical truth. She saw not just individual equations, but the entire structure of mathematics, as it exists eternally and independently of human minds. And that vision was too vast, too overwhelming for a human brain to sustain. She was not killed by disease or trauma, but by exposure to infinity, by consciousness expanded beyond what human neurology can bear. This explanation sounds mystical, unscientific, the sort of speculation that would never appear in a peer-reviewed journal. Yet how else to explain what happened to Margaret Thorne? How else to account for abilities that appeared spontaneously, intensified continuously, and ultimately consumed the person who possessed them? In 1948, Dr. Cartwright wrote an article for the Journal of Neurology reviewing unusual cases of spontaneous cognitive enhancement. She included Margaret's case, presenting it as one of the most extreme and tragic examples. Cartwright concluded that some neurological events could trigger reorganization of brain function in ways that enhanced specific cognitive domains, but that such enhancements often came at tremendous cost. The brain has finite resources, Cartwright argued. Dramatically enhancing one function necessarily depletes resources available for other functions. potentially leading to instability and breakdown. Margaret Thorne, Cartwright wrote, paid the ultimate price for her gift. Her brain was restructured to optimize mathematical cognition, but at the expense of stability and balance. She became a mathematical savant. But that savanthood was incompatible with sustained human life. Her death was not caused by any specific disease, but rather by the unsustainable state her brain had entered. She burned too bright, and like a candle flame reaching too high, she consumed herself completely. The Thorne family remained in Pine Hollow for another generation. Samuel died in 1937, Eleanor in 1943, Margaret's younger siblings scattered, some remaining in Kentucky, others moving west seeking opportunities unavailable in the mountains. By 1960, the cabin where Margaret had been born and died stood empty, slowly collapsing as nature reclaimed it. Today, Pine Hollow is a ghost settlement. The coal mines closed in the 1960s, and the families who had lived there for generations relocated to cities with better economic prospects. The one-room schoolhouse where Margaret learned to read has long since fallen to ruins. The shed where she first wrote her impossible equations is gone, reclaimed by forest. Only a few stone foundations and the cemetery remain, marking where a community once existed. But Margaret's legacy persists. Her prime number formula, though computationally impractical, revealed theoretical insights that influenced later work in number theory. Several papers published in the 1970s and 80s acknowledged inspiration from Margaret's approach, using her geometric methods to attack related problems. She remains a footnote in the history of mathematics, the untutored genius who saw patterns no one else could see and paid for that vision with her life. Professor Whittaker died in 1952, having spent 30 years trying to understand what he had witnessed in that mountain cabin. His final paper, published posthumously, was titled On the Limits of Human Mathematical Cognition. In it, he argued that there might be an upper bound to how much mathematical insight a human brain could sustain. That consciousness and mathematical truth were not infinitely compatible, that pushing too far into the realm of pure mathematics might literally break the mind attempting the journey. Margaret Thorne, Whittaker concluded, ventured further into mathematical space than any human before her. What she found there was both beautiful and deadly. She saw truths we may never understand, patterns we may never replicate, structures that exist beyond human capacity to fully comprehend. And that vision killed her. She stands as both an inspiration and a warning. There are doors in consciousness we might be better off leaving closed. There are forms of knowledge that come at too high a price. Mathematics may be infinite, but human minds are not. Margaret forgot that, or perhaps never knew it, and the mathematics she loved so deeply consumed her completely. If you found this case as disturbing as I did, let me know in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, what time it is where you are, and whether you believe consciousness can be fundamentally altered in the way Margaret's was. Share this story with anyone interested in the mysteries of the human mind, the nature of mathematical truth, and the cases that science still cannot fully explain. Because some stories remain unexplained even after all the evidence is examined. Some abilities emerge that challenge everything we think we know about human potential. And some people, like Margaret Thorne, pay the ultimate price for gifts they never asked for and could never control. The horrifying case of Margaret Thorne, a genius who saw too much, knew too much, and was ultimately destroyed by the very gift that made her extraordinary. Her story continues to haunt mathematicians and neuroscientists alike, asking questions we still cannot answer about the relationship between mind and mathematics, between consciousness and truth, between human limits and infinite knowledge. This is the story of the girl who could see mathematical patterns underlying all of reality, and it's far more tragic than you ever imagined.